Audrey Sterling-Blackwood hired Devlin Carter because he was the only driver who dared to tell her the limousine wasn't safe to move. 3 weeks later, on a mountain road with no signal, 2 black SUVs boxed them in, cutting off the front one, sealing the rear. The security escort had gone silent on the radio. The billionaire ordered Devlin to stop to comply to avoid a confrontation she believed money could resolve. He didn't stop. He pulled her down behind the seat, cut the wheel hard, and drove them through a service road soaked in rain. When Audrey asked where a broke driver learned to move like that, Devlin said only, "Before I drove a CEO, I used to bring people home alive. If you believe ordinary people can hide extraordinary pasts, stay with us because this rescue is only getting started." The morning Devlin Carter drove to the Blackwood estate for his interview, he wore the same charcoal suit he had worn to his wife's funeral 3 years before, pressed clean and buttoned at the collar with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that effort was not the same as performance. The suit had been his father's before that altered twice, and it carried the kind of history that money couldn't replicate. The other candidates waiting in the marble-floored foyer looked like men who had spent money to appear useful. Tailored lapels, polished shoes, the practiced composure of people who had learned to simulate calm rather than possess it. Devlin sat with his hands resting on his knees, watching the room the way he had learned to watch rooms, not at the center, but at the edges where the exits were, where the sight lines crossed, where the variables lived. He was the only black man in that foyer, and he had long since stopped registering that fact as remarkable. He registered it the way he registered everything as information. He had submitted the application because his daughter Tessa had printed it for him and told him to stop pretending that being broke was the same as being humble. When the assistant led him to the vehicle bay, Devlin was asked to demonstrate a standard pickup sequence: open the rear door, settle the principal, confirm the route. Instead of opening the door, he walked the length of the vehicle first, crouching once at the rear passenger tire, tilting his head near the front left wheel, while glancing at the undercarriage from the side, running 2 fingers along the seam of the rear bumper. Gideon Cross, Audrey Sterling, Blackwood's head of security, stood watching from 6 feet away with the expression of a man who had seen this kind of theater before and was not impressed by it. But Devlin was not performing. He had found that the rear right tire was running 17 pounds per square inch below the safe operating threshold, and he would not move a vehicle carrying a passenger until that was corrected. He said so plainly, without apology and without inflation. And when the technician confirmed the reading, Gideon's expression shifted by the smallest possible degree. Devlin did not look at him to check. Audrey herself appeared in the bay doorway when the delay ran long, carrying a coffee and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to running meetings rather than waiting for them to begin. She studied Devlin for a moment the way she studied anomalies in a financial report, methodically without commitment, looking for the pattern that would tell her what she was actually looking at. She asked him whether he always slowed down schedules like this, and he told her he only did it when the schedule was moving faster than the safety margin could sustain. There was no charm in his voice, no effort to be liked, no pivot toward a compliment designed to manage her reaction. Gideon noted afterward that Devlin's military service record contained several years of sealed deployment history, which was either a reason to disqualify him or a reason to look more carefully, depending on how you thought about things like that. Audrey filed the detail and moved to the road test. During the assessment that followed, Devlin identified construction staging on the primary route and rerouted without being asked, handling Audrey's sudden mid-trip destination change with the same unhurried adaptation he brought to everything else. When she changed the drop point again without warning, he did not ask why or express frustration. He simply updated his line and arrived at the new location with 2 minutes to spare. When he returned the vehicle to the bay, he parked it with the nose out, the habit of someone who never wanted to reverse in a hurry without having already planned for the moment. Audrey hired him before the day was out. She didn't know he was a former Navy SEAL. She hired him because he was the only candidate who had checked the tires and because when she asked him a direct question, he gave her a direct answer. and that combination turned out to be rarer than she had expected at any income level. The first week taught Devlin more about Audrey Sterling-Blackwood's world than the job description had suggested it would. Her schedule changed 3 times before noon each morning, not because of chaos, but because of control. She moved her own calendar like a chess clock, pushing meetings forward or back to maintain an advantage that most people around her didn't notice she was manufacturing. Every person who approached the vehicle at curb pickup had something to gain from the approach, a briefing delivered where no one could interrupt, a request positioned while she was in motion and had nowhere to redirect her attention, a compliment framed as small talk that was actually a survey of her mood. Devlin absorbed all of it from the front seat without remark, watching the mirrors, cataloging the patterns, keeping the interior temperature at the same consistent level she had mentioned once and never repeated. He called Tessa on his lunch break on the second day, sitting in the parking structure below the Blackwood Meridian Tower in the old sedan he'd driven to the interview. He told her he wouldn't have to sell her mother's car, that the salary would cover the back rent and still leave something for the spring semester, and that she should stop checking the bank app every morning because it was not a productive habit. Tessa laughed and said he sounded like a man who had just remembered he was allowed to catch a break. He said he sounded like her father, which was the same thing. Audrey passed the sedan on her way to a coffee meeting and noticed the call, not the content, just the register of a man's voice, speaking with the particular care of someone trying not to worry the person on the other end. She didn't ask about it, she filed. What she did notice over those first 10 days was what Devlin didn't do. He didn't ask about holiday bonuses, didn't repeat vehicle conversations to other staff, didn't close the gap between driver and passenger with small talk designed to make himself memorable, didn't angle for additional responsibility without being offered at first. He positioned himself exactly where he needed to be in every context, near enough to act far enough not to crowd with the reliability of something calibrated rather than trained. The members of her security team maintained their proximity through protocol. Devlin maintained his through judgment, and the difference was visible if you had spent enough years watching people who were paid to pretend compared to people who simply knew. He noted that her protection detail changed formation without updating her that the vehicle bay's entry log was signed manually and not cross-referenced against the electronic keycard system, that schedule details moved through channels too wide for the information they carried. He noted all of it and said nothing because his job was to drive, and driving was what he did. There is something worth pausing on here. Devlin Carter was a man carrying the full weight of what this country asks of its black veterans: prove yourself first, then prove yourself again, then wait to see if the proof was enough. He had served at the highest level, buried his wife, raised his daughter, and still walked into that marble foyer, understanding that the room would make its assessment before he opened his mouth. What's remarkable is not that he carried all of that. It's that he carried it without letting it harden into bitterness. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. After a board dinner on a Wednesday in late October, as Devlin pulled out of the parking structure onto the main avenue, he noticed a gray sedan parked across the street. He would not have thought anything of it if he hadn't seen the same vehicle that morning outside the waterfront office, and at noon near the Cascade Club entrance, same sedan, different position, same driver silhouette in the headrest profile. He didn't say anything. He needed a third instance before he would say anything. Once was noise, twice was correlation. 3 times was a pattern worth treating as a fact. By the end of the following week, Devlin had 3 separate location entries for the same vehicle. A gray 4-door with a hairline scratch on the passenger side front bumper, caught at different angles in the mirrors during entirely different routes at different times of day. He had noted the estimated driver height from headrest position, the behavior of holding a constant following distance rather than accelerating through traffic naturally, and the fact that the vehicle had appeared twice after route changes, not communicated outside the car. He compiled the observations into a written summary the way he had always compiled relevant intelligence, specific attributed free of conclusions he couldn't support with documentation, and gave it to Gideon Cross. The next morning, Gideon ran the partial plate through available channels and came back that afternoon with the information that it matched a rental vehicle with no flag on record, a category covering thousands of vehicles in Seattle on any given day. He thanked Devlin for the information in the tone of a man professionally obligated not to dismiss subordinates, but who had effectively already done so, and suggested that high-profile executives often attracted surveillance from competitors' journalists and research firms, none of whom constituted an actionable threat. Devlin acknowledged the response, said nothing further, and the following morning changed the route to Audrey's 9 o'clock meeting without advanced notice, taking a variation that bypassed the usual approach by 6 blocks. The gray sedan appeared at the secondary exit. There was no way to know the alternate route unless someone had access to the tracking data from the navigation system or had been briefed by someone inside the scheduling chain. Devlin told Audrey directly when they were stopped at a light and the sedan was visible in the mirror, not as an alarm, but as a data point she deserved to hold herself. She asked for evidence. He described the 3 instances, the timing correlation, and the secondary exit appearance. She was quiet for 4 blocks. She was a woman who ran her decisions on information, and she had learned over many years that the fastest way to neutralize her was to give her incomplete data. She didn't dismiss Devlin's report the way Gideon had. She asked what he needed to confirm the hypothesis, and he said he needed to check the vehicle's underside for hardware that didn't belong to the installed system. Without advance notice, so that no one with bay access could move anything before he looked, she told him to proceed. That night, in the lower parking level of the estate, Devlin swept the limousine's undercarriage with a magnetic detection tool purchased that afternoon from a commercial security supplier. 22 minutes in, he found a small tracking unit mounted above the rear axle housing, sealed in a weatherproof case, transmitting on a frequency outside the estate's fleet system. The adhesion mount's cure time indicated placement during a specific window when the vehicle was in the bay and the bay was accessible. It had not been there by accident, and it had not been placed by anyone who didn't have a key. Gideon Cross did not dismiss the device. He photographed it in place, removed it with gloved hands, and sealed it in an evidence bag while making calls. His expression for the first time since Devlin's arrival carried the quality of a professional who has discovered a problem he cannot categorize as routine. Access to the vehicle's undercarriage required either a key card for the lower bay or an escort credential for maintenance vendors, narrowing the list of people who could have placed the device to individuals across 3 categories: maintenance crew, executive protection team, and senior administrative staff with bay clearance. Von Reddick, Gideon's deputy director of security, was on that list. Neither man said this out loud because naming a suspect before you have evidence is how investigations become personal, and personal becomes dangerous. What they agreed on was that the circle of people receiving Audrey's schedule would shrink immediately. Implemented without explanation to the staff, it excluded. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to move faster than the truth can keep up with. Devlin didn't accuse. He observed. He documented. He waited. In a world that rewards noise, there is quiet power in the person who collects facts before they collect enemies. Audrey was spending those same days preparing for a board vote on the proposed sale of Meridian Routing Systems, the logistics intelligence division of Blackwood Meridian Group, to an investment vehicle whose ownership structure traced through 4 holding companies before arriving at an entity registered in a jurisdiction that required no public disclosure. The offered price was below internal valuation by a margin too large to be explained by standard discount modeling. Her uncle Karile had been pressing the vote forward for 6 weeks, collecting proxy commitments from members she hadn't personally lobbied, scheduling confirmation calls during hours she was known to be unavailable. She had found 2 of the anomalies herself, running the numbers on a flight back from a conference and arriving at the kind of figure that changes a question from financial to legal. The data was specific enough that she had begun building a private evidentiary file before saying a word to anyone. Devlin overheard a portion of Audrey's call with Kirill on the Thursday before the scheduled vote, not intentionally, but the acoustic carry from the rear of the vehicle on a slow stretch of highway made certain high-register frequencies audible from the front seat. The call was one-sided from his position, but the pattern of her responses measured refusal, repetition of the same two data points. The flatness of her voice when she was choosing precision over volume told him enough about what was happening on the other end. He began to understand that the threat to her was not only reputational or financial, that it was structural and timed, and that the timing was specific to the 48 hours surrounding the vote. He said nothing about what he'd heard and instead requested that Audrey approve a restricted schedule protocol for the following week, limiting advance notice of her movements to himself, Gideon, and one administrative contact. She agreed without requiring full justification, which told him something about how far her trust had moved in 3 weeks. That night, the lower bay camera lost its signal for exactly 12 minutes between 11:47 and 11:59. The feed was restored without an incident report. Von Reddick was the only member of the team with remote override access to the bay's camera relay. Gideon Cross had spent 22 years in federal law enforcement before moving into private executive protection, and he had developed the kind of patient skepticism that made him good at the job. He had run a secondary background investigation on Devlin from the day Audrey hired him, not because he suspected anything specific, but because a sealed service record was not a detail he was willing to leave unresolved. The deeper inquiry returned, this Devlin Carter had served more than a decade in naval special warfare, completing multiple operational deployments in classified contexts, followed by 2 years as a maritime safety consultant for a federal contracting firm before his transition into civilian transportation. His discharge was fully honorable. His post-service background was the straight line of someone who had made a deliberate decision to become something quieter and had kept to it without deviation. Audrey asked Devlin about the sealed record directly, not accusatorially, but in the way she approached any obscured data point, as though the obscuring was itself a fact worth examining. He told her he hadn't been hired as a bodyguard, that his military history wasn't relevant to the position, and that he had listed prior service without elaboration, because that was accurate and sufficient. She pushed. She wanted to know whether he had the capacity to protect her if required. He said that having the capacity and having the authorization were different things, and that she already had a professional security team. She asked why he kept the distance. He told her he had spent years treating every assignment as more important than what he was going home to, and that the cost of that trade had not been abstract. He had missed things he couldn't go back to, and the missed things had mattered to people he loved. Audrey did not press further. She recognized the shape of someone who had learned to stay useful in order to stay present, and she had her own version of the same distance constructed for different reasons and maintained with equal consistency. What this story is also about, underneath the tracking devices and the board votes, is the particular loneliness of competence. Devlin Carter knew things most people in that building couldn't imagine knowing, and he had spent years learning that knowing wasn't the same as belonging. The question the story is quietly asking is, can a person who has been trained to protect everyone finally allow himself to be somewhere safe? The anonymous call came at 9:17 that evening, routed through a masked number to Devlin's personal phone. The voice was calm and unhurried, the voice of someone who believed they were making an offer rather than delivering a threat. Drive Friday's route without deviation. Don't alert anyone, and his daughter would never have reason to know anything had happened. Devlin listened to the recording twice, confirmed Tessa was safe through a direct call, and wrote down every word. Tessa was in her dormitory mid-conversation with a study group, entirely unaware. Devlin listened to her voice for 40 seconds before she had to go. His daughter, who had his wife's way of talking with her hands even over the phone, who was going to be an engineer, who had printed that application and told him to stop hiding inside his own dignity. He sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment building and made his decision the way he had always made decisions under pressure, quickly, with the next 2 steps already mapped before he moved. He called Gideon, first filed a formal report through the state's emergency protocol, and then called the non-emergency line to establish a record. He did not mention his operational history. He mentioned what had happened, and that was enough. Gideon traced the originating relay to a disposable device activated within 2 blocks of the estate security office, and Tessa's campus was notified through a third-party security contact without alarm. She was advised to vary her routes as a standard precaution and asked no questions that framing couldn't satisfy. She was not moved to the estate, not placed under visible protection, not inserted into the threat's architecture as a controlled variable. Audrey heard about the call through Gideon's report and offered the estate's guest accommodations a full protective detail for Tessa round-the-clock monitoring. The offer was genuine. He declined, explaining that the call had been designed to produce exactly that response. Fear translated into consolidation, a smaller perimeter that someone else could then control. Audrey called him inflexible. He said she was proposing to make his daughter part of her fortress, and that protecting Tessa didn't require accepting the threat's own frame. It required making the threat irrelevant instead. The conversation was direct and honest in the way that conversations between people who don't manipulate each other can be direct. And afterward, Audrey sat thinking for a long time about the difference between people who protected her because they were paid to and the one man who had just refused her help because it would have been the wrong kind. Friday was the scheduled document signing at Blackwood Island, the exact timetable and route the caller had told Devlin not to change. Audrey decided to keep the appointment. She had never operated from a position of concealment, and she believed with the particular conviction of someone who had won more confrontations than she had lost, that the answer to being threatened was not to become less visible, but to become more armored with fact. The convoy assembled at 7:30, an advanced vehicle carrying 2 protection team members, the limousine with Devlin and Audrey, and a trailing vehicle under Von Reddick's direct command. The departure time had been communicated through the standard scheduling channel as it always was. They were 40 minutes out of the city when the advanced vehicle turned off the agreed route, its driver communicating over radio that there was an incident ahead requiring deviation. The transmission was followed immediately by static that wasn't weather-related. The frequency was being compressed, not degraded. Devlin's hands didn't move from the wheel, but his eyes moved constantly between the mirror and the road ahead, and what he saw over the next 90 seconds confirmed what the static had already told him. A black SUV had moved into close following distance behind them, its front grille the wrong height for a civilian vehicle. Ahead, a second SUV was angling across both lanes from a maintenance pullout, blocking the forward path in a geometry that gave the limousine approximately 4 car lengths of stopping room. Audrey told him to stop calmly and clearly, the way she issued directives in every situation she believed she could resolve through authority. Devlin told her to get down and stay down, and his voice carried the quality that does not wait for agreement before it proceeds. He did not drive into either vehicle. He cut the wheel left and reversed in a controlled arc into a narrow service access road whose entrance was half concealed behind a drainage barrier not on any commercial navigation map, but present in the maintenance survey data he had downloaded and memorized 3 days before. The SUVs could not follow without scraping the concrete channel markers, a clearance he had measured in advance. Devlin drove the rutted, rain-soaked surface the way someone drives terrain they have already decided they can manage, committed and precise, while Audrey remained pressed behind the rear headrest without question, which told him something about how completely she had decided to trust him in the moment that mattered. He deactivated the vehicle's commercial GPS to prevent the signal from being tracked by anyone monitoring the fleet system and activated a personal satellite emergency beacon he had placed in the door pocket 3 days earlier. A unit registered to a contact outside the estate's network entirely. At a decommissioned forest checkpoint 3 miles along the access road, he stopped the limousine beside a parked maintenance vehicle, walked Audrey into the checkpoint structure, and locked the car. It was there, checking her hands for injury in the yellow generator light, that he found her phone running abnormally hot for a device in sleep mode, the sign of a continuous background process. He ran a standard diagnostic check and identified a monitoring application authenticated using a certificate belonging to the protection team's internal system. Someone on the team had installed surveillance software on the CEO's personal device. The certificate timestamp was 3 weeks old. The checkpoint was a one-room structure with a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a wall of old survey maps. And Audrey used the 90 minutes before the beacon would bring a response the way she used all periods of involuntary stillness by working the problem. Devlin sat across from her with the contents of his door pocket arranged on the table. The beacon, a backup radio unit, a compact first aid kit, and a notepad on which he had written the license plates of both SUVs, the call time from the anonymous threat, and the timestamp on the tracking device's adhesive cure. She looked at the notepad and thought, not for the first time, that he was the most organized person who had ever been terrified on her behalf. And then she thought he probably wasn't terrified, which was both comforting and unsettling, depending on how she chose to sit with it. She walked through the corporate structure of the Meridian Routing Systems vote. The 48-hour window, the emergency authorization clause in the board charter allowing proxy votes to be activated if the CEO was unreachable and a quorum found it necessary. The fact that Carile had been building that quorum for 6 weeks. The fact that the company acquiring Meridian had ownership layers pointing eventually toward a private equity vehicle that had been in direct communication with Carile's personal legal team. She laid it out the way she would lay out a hostile acquisition analysis, structured, sequenced without the inflation of fear. Devlin listened without interrupting. He asked one question. What happened after the 48 hours if the vote passed and she reappeared? She said she would be described as having experienced an instability, a disappearance with no clear cause, a decision to leave her protection detail under stress, and that Carile would control enough of the board narrative to make the stability question a reason to limit her authority even after her physical return. He said the plan required someone inside the security structure with scheduling access. She said Gideon's access level was the highest in the system. He said the route change in today's convoy had been made by Vaughn, not Gideon, that Gideon had proposed a different approach and been overridden by Vaughn at the 40-minute mark before departure. She was quiet for a long moment. She asked why he hadn't driven away when he'd had the opportunity. He was a driver. The vehicle was running. There had been moments on that road when leaving would have been defensible. He said she was in his car, and that when a person is in your car, the moment your responsibility ends is not written on a paycheck. She looked at him for a long time in the generator light and said she genuinely did not know how to trust something she hadn't purchased, structured, or verified in advance. He said he wanted his paycheck to arrive on time and his schedule to make reasonable sense. She laughed, not a composed laugh, but the involuntary kind, the sound that belongs to the actual person rather than the public version. And then the backup radio crackled and Gideon's voice came through, compressed and low. Don't contact city police. Vaughn controls that communication line. Devlin verified Gideon's identity through a challenge phrase from a pre-departure security attendant, a procedural detail he had retained not because he suspected he'd need it, but because retaining procedural details was a habit older than any specific threat. When the response came back correct, he told Audrey they had a confirmed channel. Gideon had been locked out of the estate's control room by a series of remote access commands bearing Vaughn's authentication credentials, rerouted through a guest terminal Vaughn had claimed was being used for a vendor check. 3 members of the protection detail had been dispatched to a location 20 minutes away based on a fabricated emergency notification. Vaughn had filed a situation report stating that Devlin had isolated Audrey by exploiting her trust that the limousine had been in a road incident, and Audrey's status was unknown. A report already reaching the board members Carile had cultivated for 6 weeks. Devlin did not suggest returning to the estate. He suggested moving to a location with independent jurisdictional authority, physical distance from the compromised systems, and a contact he had worked with before in a civilian capacity. He had assisted in a search and rescue coordination exercise near the Cascade foothills 2 years earlier, and the county sheriff, Dean Hollister, had given him a direct number with the instruction that certain situations called for a person rather than a department. They reached Hollister's Mountain District Station using a Forest Service access route, a borrowed vehicle from the checkpoint's maintenance shed, and a handheld navigation unit independent of any commercial mapping service. Audrey kept Devlin's notepad through the entire transit, updating it continuously, cross-referencing timelines, building an evidentiary record with the precision she brought to an earnings audit. At the station, they had access to Hollister's secure radio system, a body camera running a continuous timestamp, and the ability to transmit materials through a state law enforcement channel that Vaughn had no way to access or monitor. One of the SUVs reacquired their approximate position from the direction of the beacon's earlier activation and appeared at the station's lower access road. Devlin positioned the hydraulic gate across the drive, activated the perimeter lighting, and documented the vehicle's arrival on the body camera rather than meeting the occupants directly. The vehicle sat for 14 minutes before departing. County deputies arrived 11 minutes after that. The SUV was located 3 miles down the county road, abandoned, both occupants on foot in the tree line. One was carrying a sealed folder containing a document on Blackwood Meridian letterhead describing a compensation agreement naming Devlin Carter by name in exchange for services defined as ensuring continuity of executive schedule for a 48-hour period. The amount was $1 million. It was unsigned. It was also the most useful piece of evidence they had found yet, because fabricated paper trails only get built by people who expect to need them. There is something quietly instructive in the way Devlin handled every moment in that checkpoint. He didn't demand to be believed. He didn't explain himself more than necessary. He simply continued doing the next right thing and trusted that documentation in the end would speak louder than accusation. It's worth remembering the most durable defense anyone has is a clear record of how they actually behaved. By the following morning, the narrative had been released to 3 financial news outlets by a source described as a concerned board member. The version in circulation, Audrey Sterling-Blackwood's newly hired driver, a man with a partially sealed military record, had diverted her from her security detail on the day of a critical signing. The limousine had been abandoned on a service road. A compensation document had been recovered, connecting the driver to an undisclosed arrangement. The CEO's location was unknown. Carelli expressed through a spokesperson the family's deep concern and their hope for a swift resolution. Vaughn submitted a formal incident report stating that Devlin had isolated Audrey by exploiting her trust that his special operations background represented an undisclosed capability that should have triggered a flag during hiring, and that the board should treat the situation as an act of abduction until evidence proved otherwise. Audrey refused to remain out of contact. She understood what Carril was doing with the clock. Every hour she wasn't publicly present and demonstrably capable was an hour the emergency authorization argument became more credible. And credibility in a boardroom didn't require proof. It required repetition. She recorded a video statement on Hollister's county-issued tablet. She was safe in direct communication with law enforcement, had left the convoy voluntarily because it had been compromised from inside. The responsible party had been identified, and she was fully capable of leading Blackwood Meridian Group through a board meeting that afternoon or any afternoon she chose. She itemized what the investigation had confirmed and stated that any board action taken in her absence without verified authorization was subject to legal challenge. The video was transmitted to Helena Ashford through a direct encrypted line Hollister provided. An older state bar association protocol Helena knew still functioned, along with a compressed file of the documentation assembled through the night. Helena watched the video twice, read the attached materials, spent 6 minutes on a call with the board's independent governance council, and began preparing the legal framework to make the claims actionable. While she was reading, she found the board meeting had been advanced by 12 hours, with effective notice issued at 3:42 in the morning, while Audrey was still in the checkpoint structure with a generator for light. The calculation was straightforward. They needed Audrey in a room with verified witnesses before a quorum could be declared without her, and the window was contracting. Devlin's preference was to approach through a logistics access corridor in the tower's lower structure and reach the correct floor without passing through the public lobby where a visible confrontation could be staged and photographed. Audrey's preference was the main entrance. She explained that arriving through a service door would be described as secretive, as confirming the instability narrative as the behavior of someone who had been coached to hide. And she was not hiding. She was walking into her building the way she had always walked into her building. And she was doing it first, so that no one else could define the moment. Devlin accepted this without argument, asked for independent security personnel to control the lobby entry, and Hollister provided 2 county deputies in civilian dress, who carried the legal authority to manage access without appearing conspicuous. Gideon had spent the night working from an external location after regaining remote access to a subset of the estate's secondary systems, and he met them at a neutral point 8 blocks from the building to transfer his documentation package. His files included Vaughn's time-stamped route changes across the previous 3 weeks, camera footage of Vaughn entering the vehicle bay during the 12-minute blackout, a log of remote commands issued through Vaughn's credentials to the estate's communication relay, a personnel reassignment order removing 3 protection team members from the convoy's original formation, and wire transfer records from a corporate consulting firm whose sole recorded client was a fund vehicle connected to Carelli's personal holding structure. Gideon said without ceremony that he owed Devlin an apology for the first week. Devlin said it wasn't necessary. Gideon said it was. Helena had traced the consulting firm's corporate registration backward through 4 jurisdictions to a legal entity controlled by Carelli's chief of staff. Mason Whitlock had agreed with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long to provide a written statement, confirming that the Meridian acquisition had been flagged internally as anomalous by 2 members of the finance division, that the anomaly reports had been suppressed under pressure from Carelli's office, and that the offer price had been structured to benefit a class of preferred equity holders whose identities were not disclosed in the public transaction documents. When the vehicle turned onto the main avenue and the tower came into view, Devlin pulled to the drop-off position he had used every weekday for 3 weeks, put the car in park, and looked at Audrey for a moment without speaking. She said she was ready. He came around the front of the car to her door, opened it, stood where he had always stood, close enough not crowding. And Audrey stepped out into the October morning and walked toward her building. Carell had opened the session 12 minutes before the scheduled call to order, citing the emergency authorization language in the board charter and the testimony of Vaughn's incident report. He stood at the head of the conference table in the manner of someone who had been rehearsing the posture for years. Measured, concerned, the reluctant steward stepping forward in a moment of institutional necessity. His presentation rested on 4 premises: that Audrey had voluntarily removed herself from her security team, demonstrating a breakdown in judgment under pressure, that her absence created material uncertainty about her capacity to perform executive duties, and that the board had both the right and the responsibility to stabilize the company's governance while the situation was assessed. He was midway through the 3rd premise when the elevator doors at the far end of the corridor opened. Audrey walked into the room without hesitation, without drama, without performing the entrance. She set a flat document case on the table, acknowledged 3 board members by first name, and sat in her chair. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something is shifted that everyone present can feel, but not yet name. Carell said her name, and then said that perhaps, given the circumstances, a brief recess to confirm her current state would be appropriate. She said her current state was fine and asked whether he'd like to proceed or whether she should start. She presented the tracking device, its installation window, and the list of individuals with bay access. She presented the phone monitoring software and its authentication certificate. She presented Vaughn's route change log alongside Gideon's original route recommendation that had been overridden. She presented the camera blackout timestamp and the remote access record that corresponded to it. She presented the fabricated compensation document recovered from the abandoned SUV, the Blackwood Meridian letterhead, the $1 million figure, the unsigned signature line. She presented the financial mapping Helena had assembled, the consulting firm, the holding structure, the fund vehicle, the preferred equity class that stood to benefit from a below-market sale. She presented Mason Whitlock's written statement. She presented the timeline that made all of it coherent. The reason her absence had needed to be exactly 48 hours was the specific threshold in the charter's emergency authorization language. And the reason the route had needed to be that particular road was that it was the only corridor without camera coverage in the county grid. Gideon Cross confirmed every security-related document in the package item by item. Helena Ashford confirmed the legal chain of corporate ownership tracing back to Carelli's chief of staff. Mason Whitlock appeared by video from a conference room on the building's lower level and confirmed the internal suppression of the anomaly reports. Vaughn had been detained by county deputies in the lobby 17 minutes before the meeting began. Carelli said when the room had absorbed everything that he had never intended for anyone to be endangered, that his objective had been to protect the company's long-term interests, and that he had not known the methods his intermediaries would employ. Audrey said that a plan requiring her to be incapacitated for 48 hours, removed from communication, and subsequently described as mentally unstable was not a business decision. It was an action against her liberty, and attaching corporate strategy to it did not change its nature. The room was very quiet for a long time, and then a board member with 2 decades of service asked in a careful voice whether the board was being asked to place confidence in a driver whose special operations background had been omitted from his hiring application. Audrey looked at the man for a moment and said that Devlin Carter's background was currently more thoroughly documented than anyone else's in the room, and that she invited the question to be asked again once everyone present had fully verified their own. Devlin was not in the room. He was in the corridor outside, standing near the deputy Hollister and a county investigator providing a formal statement. He did not describe classified operational history. He described the specific documentable sequence of events from the day he first noted the gray sedan, the tracking device, the threat call, the departure convoy, the service road, the checkpoint, the mountain station, the chain of evidence, custody from the moment he found the tracking unit to the moment he handed it to Gideon. Everything he stated could be confirmed through a timestamp, a recording, a third-party witness, or a physical artifact. When the county investigator asked about his military background, Devlin said his service record was available for review through the appropriate federal channels, and that nothing in it was relevant to the preceding 48 hours, because he had not performed any act in that window that required special operations training. He had driven carefully, preserved evidence carefully, and communicated carefully with law enforcement. Audrey came out of the conference room and stood beside him while he was finishing the statement. When the investigator stepped away to make a call, she said she had confirmed to the board that Devlin had acted with her full knowledge and consent at every decision point, that she had been given alternatives at each juncture, and that he had placed her safety above his own professional exposure at every stage. He said he was glad she had made that clear. She told him the board member who had raised the background question had subsequently been reminded that the application had accurately listed prior military service and that the full content of a sealed record carried no civilian disclosure obligation. He nodded once. She asked whether he had eaten anything in the past 18 hours. He said he hadn't thought about it. She told him that was probably the first thing to address. The board voted to suspend Carelli pending a full independent investigation. The Meridian Routing Systems transaction was halted immediately. A forensic audit of the company's governance communications was authorized. Vaughn was held on charges that Helena's office had helped frame by 3 o'clock that afternoon. The gray sedan, traced through the full corporate chain, belonged to a logistics subcontractor whose contract with the fund vehicle was dated 6 weeks before Devlin's first day. Audrey offered him the directorship of personal security that same evening. The kind of position that would have changed Tessa's trajectory and cleared every debt Devlin had accumulated across 3 difficult years. He declined. He didn't decline with drama or principles stated as performance. He sat in a chair in Audrey's office with the late afternoon light coming through the floor-length windows and told her that the reason he had left naval special warfare was not that he had run out of capability. It was that he had run out of willingness to spend his life in a permanent state of contingency, sleeping with a mission schedule against every personal decision, missing the ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as important until you'd passed enough of them to understand that they were. He had been at sea when his wife received her first serious diagnosis and in a briefing room when she received the second. He had arranged to be home for the third, and he was grateful for it every day, but it hadn't changed the cost of the first 2 absences. It had only confirmed that the cost had been real. He did not want the rest of his life defined by a readiness posture, even a well-compensated one. Audrey listened without redirecting him, which was how he knew she had actually heard it. She said she understood that the position she had offered was still the same category of relationship-useful instrument permanently deployed, and that she had structured the offer that way because she didn't have a different template available. He said that was honest. She thought for a moment and tried again. He could continue in an advisory capacity part-time on a schedule he set, reviewing transportation security protocols and route assessment procedures for the executive team. No permanent protective assignment, no around-the-clock availability, no obligation to insert himself into any situation he hadn't been specifically contracted to address. The work would be meaningful and the compensation would be fair. He said he would consider a 6-month trial at those terms. She asked why he had come back to save her instead of driving away when he'd had the chance. He said she was in his car, and that when a person is in your car, they are your responsibility for as long as the car is moving and the road is still uncertain. She asked whether she was still only a responsibility, and her voice held the particular quality of a question that contains more than its literal surface. He looked at her for a moment with the stillness of someone choosing words from a real place rather than a convenient one, and he said that was a question worth asking, but that it deserved to be asked when no one was in pursuit, when there was no legal proceeding pending, when the answer could be given and received without either of them standing inside the context that had produced it. She said that seemed reasonable. He said most reasonable things did when you got far enough from the emergency to see them clearly. 6 months later, Blackwood had been removed from the board by a shareholder vote that carried by a margin large enough to make the outcome unambiguous. Von Reddick had been charged with conspiracy, unlawful detention, and evidence fabrication. Several lower-level participants had cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. Gideon Cross had overseen the reconstruction of the estate's protection structure under an independent security governance framework that Helena Ashford spent 2 months designing, separating personal protection from corporate communication infrastructure in a way that closed the vectors Vaughn had exploited. Blackwood Meridian Group published a voluntary disclosure of its board structure, equity distribution, and executive authorization protocols, an unusual degree of transparency for a private corporation of its size that had not, as the skeptics predicted, hurt the stock price. Devlin spent those months working 3 days a week from a small office he shared with a retired maritime investigator in a converted industrial space near the waterfront. He had paid off the last of the medical debt. He had helped Tessa through the end of her 2nd year of mechanical engineering and driven her to the airport when she left for a summer research position she was almost unbearably proud of. He had not bought a new car. He had rebuilt the engine of the old one, the vehicle that had belonged to his wife, the one he had considered selling twice and had not, until it ran with the kind of quiet reliability that was its own form of testimony. On the day his company registered its first independent contract outside the Blackwood Meridian Consulting Agreement, Tessa arrived at the small office with a rectangular sign she had made herself the company name in clean block letters and said she was proud of him and that she was going to be late for her flight. On a Friday in April, Audrey needed to reach a house on the far side of the Sound for a weekend, with nothing on its calendar except the absence of obligation. She did not distribute the route to her protection team. She called Devlin. He arrived in the rebuilt sedan, which looked exactly like what it was, a car that had been cared for by someone who understood that value and cost are not the same measurement. She stood at the curb and looked at it for a moment and asked whether a woman of her particular public profile could ride in something like that and still be considered safe. He said safety had never come from what the car cost. She opened the front passenger door and sat down. He asked if she was certain clients generally preferred the rear seat. She said this wasn't a client arrangement. He looked at her for 3 full seconds, then started the engine and pulled away from the curb. They drove north along the coast road longer than necessary, slower than efficient, through the kind of afternoon light that lands on open water and does something worth looking at. She asked about Tessa. He asked her when she had last chosen a destination that had no meaning attached to it. She said she couldn't remember clearly. He took an unmarked turn and drove her through it anyway, all the way to a high point on the coast road, where the view opened across the Sound and the water held the last of the day's light in a way that made it feel like something preserved rather than passing. He stopped the car and let it do what it did. She said she had believed for a long time that his sealed record was the thing that made him extraordinary. The training, the capability, the man she had needed on a mountain road with 2 SUVs cutting off both ends of an empty corridor. She understood now that the more extraordinary thing was simpler. He had all of that capacity and had never once used it to make her smaller. He said the past had taught him how to move people out of danger, how to identify the threat, change the route, hold the line until something safer opened. The harder lesson, the one that had taken longer and cost more, was learning to stay when the danger had passed. She asked if he was going to stay this time. He looked out at Puget Sound, at the light going low and warm over the water, at the direction that led neither toward a mission nor away from something, but simply forward into the ordinary life he had always meant to build. He said he didn't have anywhere left to run to, and the woman who had once hired a broke black single father to drive her limousine because he was the only one willing to say the car wasn't safe, finally understood what she had found. A man who knew how to bring people home alive and had decided at last that home could include himself. The bravest thing Devlin Carter did in this story wasn't on the mountain road. It was quieter than that. It was choosing, after years of serving every mission but his own, to build something small and permanent for himself and his daughter. Sometimes the most courageous act is simply deciding that your own life is worth showing up for.